Hi all, I have a very exciting game to show you from the Isle of Man Open. This is in round 5. Magnus Carlsen was playing white against Julio, Ernesto, Granda Zuniga, excuse the pronunciation. Very established grandmaster. We have e4 by Magnus. We have now black playing the Petrov defense. So a very solid reputation, sometimes a little bit dull. White took on e5. There are some exciting lines with knight c3 that have been played recently where we have opposite side castling, and that's been doing alright for white. Magnus chooses here d4, d5, more tried and tested variation with a slight edge for white. Now we have knight c3 here, knight c6, c takes. Quite often black plays knight takes d5. I'll give you an example. This has been seen before, and it's thought to be slightly better for white, this kind of variation. But here we have, this has also been seen before, knight b4. So trying to re-establish that d5 blockade against white's isolated queen's pawn, IQP as it's known. Now here h3 to stop any bishop g4, it seems quite handy. And c6 now, and here to stop any knight b4 in particular, because queen c2 is facilitated now with a3, rook e8, queen c2. So white has the traditional perks of the isolated queen's pawn, some attacking pressure, but black, structurally seems fine. White's pieces are quite active, and in particular the isolated queen's pawn has a good support for the e5 square and c5. But here e5 is the most dangerous for black if a knight gets perched on e5. We see black playing h6. Maybe he was a bit concerned about knight takes d5 here. I'll give you an example. Say a6, a token move, knight takes. If black takes like this, as well as fixing, well, helping white structurally, and it's symmetrical, but white has an edge here with bishop f4, with things like bishop c7. There's a small edge there anyway, and the queen doesn't really want to take that because it might mean bishop c4 is dangerous, eyeing f7 for example. So h6 does seem a concession though, and we have knight takes d5 now, which, although black replaces the blockader, knight e5 is dangerous now. This knight, which the isolated queen's pawn supports, in conjunction with bishop h7, you can see this is really dangerous. We see black playing bishop d6, and Magnus does play now bishop h7 check. Can you see why king h8 is not a good idea? Yeah, I'll show you. King h8 is not a good idea because it's actually checkmate. It's not even about winning the queen. Because if it was about winning the queen, there's rook takes e1 checkmate for white here. So that's actually checkmate there. So the king goes to what looks to be a strange location to be in, f8. And it adds a bit more power to this bishop d2, because sometimes this bishop could use this angle in theory. Bishop d2, so connecting rooks, and there's now a threat on the cards. Can you see what white is threatening? If I play a token move, what would you play here with white? This wasn't played. I just want to test you guys to make sure you're awake. So white to play here, what would you play in this position? Okay. Knight takes f7 would be crushing in this position. Yeah, it's crushing in all lines. Here's an example line. Just winning the rook on e8. Yeah, this is pretty devastating stuff. Okay, so we see actually f7 reinforced with a sensible move, bishop e6. Rook e2, white just doubles now against that e6 bishop. Knight f6. Magnus doesn't mind leaving that bishop to be taken if it is going to be taken. The queen looks very dangerous to come in there. Now we see queen c7, and positioning, yeah, this is nice to double rooks, but can you see now what is played in this position? If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video, white play. Now actually this is more complicated if you consider all the different resources black has available. White played a fantastic move knight g6 check. He has to factor in all of black's resources to do this. Because remember, his bishop's kind of stuck in the middle of nowhere there. Now, black hasn't got any choices apart from to take at this point. Now, rook takes e6, and black does have choices here to consider. He actually chose knight takes h7. And in the game, I mean, this just actually loses a pawn in the game continuation to taking, and then queen takes g6, so it's actually losing a pawn. Now, before we go on from there, what had to be considered, well, was the possibility of bishop h2 check, and then taking here. And this is total, like, genius, basically. Rook takes e6, knight takes. What does white play in this position? Which means it's very good for white. If I give you 5 seconds, Magnus must have seen this line. It's incredible. If I give you 5 seconds here, white to play. Okay, not queen takes g6, but bishop b4 check. On queen takes g6, this is just, it's equal. Black can just play king g8, and it's kind of equal. The knight's ready for knight f8. So that's not particularly good. No, the point here, it seems, is bishop b4 check. This is a real killer move, because after king g8, rook e7. Yeah, this is really quite subtle stuff to do with chains of forcing moves, which really transform the position. Now, the queen being forced to move, queen takes g6, threatens mate. And then, say black parries that, white can take, and then take the bishop with advantage here. Yeah, so he'd still be winning this position. Big advantage here. It's just a fascinating, to take account of all these resources in this position. So yeah, knight takes h7, bishop h2 doesn't help. Rook takes e6, and then taking here. Can you see what white plays in this variation? If I give you 5 seconds. Okay. Rook takes d6, yeah. It's a really unfortunate position for black, because this angle, which mentioned earlier with that king on f8, is comes into play here. Bishop b4. Yeah, it just looks simple on the surface, this knight g6, but did you see all these variations after knight g6? It seems totally logical, but you need to be able to back it up with all the forcing stuff as well, which Magnus, I believe, he must have seen all this stuff. So yeah, we end up with this seemingly simple, unfortunate continuation for black, where he's lost a pawn. And actually, there's not much of a game after this. Queen e7, g3 is played, which seems sensible, giving king g2 maybe later. And the queen's tied down here. We see king c7. The queen's kind of tied down to g7. Queen g6. And actually the game ended here. So I'm showing you the meat and potatoes, which is actually in the variations relating to knight g6. The game ended there. Yeah, black's a pawn down and didn't feel like playing on against Magnus. Quite understandable. Maybe he wanted the rest. He just didn't want to be ground down. I believe he had less time as well. I'll give you an example of how white can probably increase the advantage quite simply. Simple moves like this check to create further weaknesses. Bishop c3 with the idea of d5 coming up. If white wins this pawn, and then that pawn's weak, and then these pawns are going to fall later, and if the pawns get fragmented, g4 and the king could start walking on these light squares. That could be an outline plan. But yeah, you might think it's a totally premature resignation But the action is really behind the scenes in this game, the variations involving what to back up knight g6, all the forcing stuff, which is really quite tricky to appreciate, when you look at this game at one level. So yeah, a little profound game there. It seemed very, very simply played by Magnus. I hope you got something out of it. Comments, questions, likes, shares appreciated. Thanks very much.